Welcome to the Bitcoin Consciousness Podcast. I'm here today with Dan Weintraub. Did I say that correctly?
Yeah, I think it means in German, it means the grapes that are used to make wine. Yeah, Weintraub, but Weintraub here in the States.
Yeah. And so you've been on What Bitcoin Did podcast, and I heard you on DJ Valeries show.
Mm-hmm.
So I was thinking, as I often do actually on this podcast, is that I find the guests and then I refer to the previous podcast so that we here can go even deeper into some of the ideas that you sort of touched on there. Does this sound okay with you?
Yeah, sounds great.
Good. So this podcast is about higher consciousness and Bitcoin. What's your idea, or have you had experiences with higher consciousness yourself?
I kind of endeavored. So in the 1980s, I stopped using alcohol and got into meditation and that whole process of getting to know what makes me tick and how I move through the world. So meditation became an important part of my life. I was a meditation teacher for a time, and I think that for me, like the journey of personal development and higher consciousness, it took different paths, sometimes paths based upon what was happening in my life, parenthood, work life, and sort of investigating those experiences. And about, I don't know, maybe a decade or so ago, I landed on the neurophysiological imperatives and who we are as biochemical and electrical beings, how we filter information consciously and unconsciously, and how our physiology, particularly our neurophysiology, impacts the way we transit through each minute, hour, day, month, etc. So really the last iteration of consciousness seeking has been an exploration of the neurological.
Okay, so neurological is how the body works, right? And you connect this with what we eat and exercise, if we meditate, if we do things we love, or if we do things we don't like. So stuff like this, right?
Yeah, I mean, we're such interesting beings. There are roughly 8 billion of us on the planet, and we're all unique. No one human is like another human neurophysiologically, because not only is it how we're wired and what happened in utero and how we're epigenetically programmed, but there's also our experience and how neuroplasticity throughout the course of our lives has impacted the pathways that exist in our brains, the connection of our brains to our nervous systems. And all of those uniquenesses about us impact how we act, behave, think, perceive, feel. And so I look at the world around me. I observe what's happening in the world around me, whether it's in the immediate world, in the workplace or in community or in the larger world. And I examine it from a neurophysiological perspective. What impulses are people experiencing, and what hormones and neurotransmitters are acting upon their beings, and are they aware of those impulses based upon that neurophysiology, or are they simply creating meaning out of everything? Is everything become about meaning making and consciousness, and less about who we are, again, literally as electrical and chemical impulses that impact our sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous systems, and then take form in action, belief, thought, etc.
Yeah. And how does the soul or spirit fit into this?
So the beauty of human beings is that everything can be magical. Like, we are magical beings. We look out into the universe and we say, well, the great expanse of the universe, or the multiplicity of universes, is the great unknown. Or we look at the depths of the ocean and we say, the deepest parts of the ocean are the great unknown, or the center of the earth, what's really happening below the mantle and the crust and the mantle. That's the great unknown. But the great unknown is us. The great unknown is this extraordinary piece of machinery that is our brain and nervous system. And the magic, the spiritual component, the soul component, is all in there. It exists. Uh, it has mass in that it is electrical and biochemical. And part of what I try to do is tap into that. I'm not a fantastically successful practitioner in tapping into that magic, that sort of liminal space between how we move through our days and how our souls move through their days. But it's within reach for all of us, I think. It's simply a matter of what practices one engages in. And if one engages in certain practices consistently over time, one can tap further into that ethereal spirit.
Okay, okay. Many of the listeners probably are becoming quite familiar with the words I use and how I usually talk about these things. So maybe we try to merge like your discourse with mine a little bit. And I've come up with this concept of the fiat consciousness, where it's like everything that is fear-based or survival-based. So all neurological programming that is automatic or unconscious, this is, I have named this the fiat consciousness, because it's based on control. It's people using their mind to determine what to do, and the mind is then based in models from the past, and you only do this because you're afraid of what will happen. And then what I call then the Bitcoin consciousness is when we let go of all the survival instincts from inheritance, in the DNA, and from upbringing and from the culture and so on. And we step into then the Bitcoin consciousness, which is sort of a word. It basically means enlightenment, but it's Bitcoin consciousness because it has this decentralized element to it. Because when we enter the Bitcoin consciousness, when we become conscious, then we activate our node on the creation network. And then people around us activate their node on the creation network. And that's the soul. That's the soul. That's our unique tap into the creation network. So if we bring this together with what you said, you basically talked about everything in the fiat consciousness as different programs, neurological programs. It's these unconscious behaviors that people do. So they inherit these fears from the DNA or from the parents or from the schools and from the jobs. And as long as people encourage these programs, they are stuck in them, and it's loops. So in the normal mainstream world, it's fiat world, basically everybody's doing that. And then, because what I see with Bitcoin is will free people to heal themselves from all of these and come into their true state where they can consciously live in their body. And I guess this is what you mean then with tapping into that etheric nature. And it's just the mechanism of letting go of those programs that allow us to come closer to this magic inside each and every one. Does that make sense to you?
Yeah, I see it. I think that we're sort of you and I are speaking in parallel. The paper that I wrote, and the book that I wrote a few about Bitcoin, but one was this idea of the fiat brain, sort of this idea of how in a world in which money is an accelerant, not only is it an accelerant with regard to the way we live our lives, what we feel we have to purchase, what we do in this world need to purchase, etc. But it's a neurological accelerant. And so we see over the course of the last several generations and beyond an increase in neurological disorders, Parkinson's disease, multiple sclerosis, ALS. We see an increase in the incidences of drug addiction, of depression, of anxiety, you could go on and on with the types of neurological and disorders, mental illness, etc., that I attribute to the accelerant of the way we've created this umbrella of money in the world. And we unconsciously move through the world thinking, or not even thinking, just responding and reacting to this need. And it becomes articulated as the need for money. And it becomes increasingly articulated as the need for more and more money. And I see Bitcoin in a number of lights. I see Bitcoin as, because it's a network that is verified, and that all activity on the network is verified by the millions of nodes and increasing number of nodes. I see Bitcoin as a foundational digital layer for analog and digital living that will be truthful and that will demand and command truthfulness to a level and an extent that we can't fathom. And over the course of generations, centuries, it will become, our DNA will shift, our epigenetics will shift, our consciousnesses will shift to a world in which only truth makes sense, only truth exists. There will be no duplicity, there will be no lying, and because I see duplicity and lying, all of those things, as simply part of the fiat world, that most of the time when people are gaming each other and are lying to each other and are stealing from each other and are manipulating each other, it's to get something, and usually that getting of something is money and power. And so I see Bitcoin, because it is inviolable truth, as becoming the foundational layer, the actual digital foundational layer of how the world interacts, and everything that lives on it will echo that truthfulness. And so As but one example, we see an acceleration of deepfake technology and the ability to manipulate video so as to create the illusion of something happening that didn't necessarily happen. Sort of that fusion of AI and the digitization of video. On a Bitcoin network, deepfake won't live. It will die because on the Bitcoin network, it will immediately be uncovered for its deceitfulness. All of those things over the course of generations and centuries will reprogram humanity to not be trying to accumulate, because the fiat consciousness will dissipate and the Bitcoin consciousness will predominate. And in some ways, it's too bad for us in our generation. I'm 60 years old, that it's called Bitcoin, because I try to explain to my peers, you know, you hear the word Bitcoin and you hear the word cryptocurrency, and you associate cyber crime and ransomware. You associate, you know, venture capital and people trying to become millionaires and billionaires and whatnot. Bitcoin is different, and it's poorly named because it will transcend being a currency. It will transcend being a store of value. It will transcend being an investment. It will transcend being a hedge against inflation. That's all blah, blah, blah. It will become something much more profound. And my great, 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 great grandchildren will live in a world that is, by its very nature, truthful and honest. And I believe we are at the very incipience of that world. And I think that Bitcoin is one of the primary catalysts, if not the catalyst.
Yeah, very interesting. And if we dig into more of how the world will look like later, and I've been trying to do this myself, and maybe you can help me. Together we can dig into and maybe envision how actually people will relate to each other on a Bitcoin standard. Because if you look at relationships now, they're all built on attachments. It's like, because one needs something and then the another person needs something else, and that's an agreement. So it's all relationships are built on these kind of agreements, but they all come from unconscious needs. If you look at friendships, you have friends because you feel lonely or because you want to be popular, or it's usually a conscious needs. And then the other person corresponds to other things that he needs for you to stay friends. And things like this have melted away in my life. And also, I think this will melt away on a huge global scale as we go further into Bitcoin, hyper-Bitcoinization. Any thoughts about that?
Yeah. So again, I believe this is sort of where I've landed with Bitcoin, that it's so hard to have a conversation about something in the present that is so difficult to fathom in the future. Even though I've used words like hyper Bitcoinization, and I have used sort of the language of, I got into Bitcoin as someone who wanted to make a few bucks. I didn't know what it was. It's like, oh, cool, I could buy this thing and maybe it'll appreciate, and then maybe I could, get a better guitar or whatever. And then over the course of more and more and more study, and a belief that we are in this moment in history that could span, again, like stretch out over centuries, in which we're undergoing a profound shift because technology has outpaced our conscious ability to exist. We are technology has gone too fast, and we can't keep up, and we're getting sick. It's killing us. And I believe that Bitcoin offers this fascinating window into what happens, because I don't disagree with you that people are transactional by nature, whether that's part of our fiat consciousness or whether that's part of our human consciousness, and the two are inextricable. I'm not sure. I'd have to think about that. But we are transactional. But there are different kinds of transactionalities. There's financial, there's, um, building, accumulation, there's food, there's, if you look at Maslow's pyramid, I mean, if you go all the way up the pyramid of self-actualization, there are different kinds of transactionalities. But I believe that decentralization is our natural state of being, but also community is our natural state of being. We are relational beings. And in a Bitcoin world, again, so far into the future that it's hard to talk about because things seem to change so much in 5 years, let alone 500 years. In a Bitcoin world, we will live in small communities. We'll live in small, what appear to be very analog communities, where we will grow our own food and where we will make our own rules, what we would call today communes or intentional communities. And of course, we'll be connected to other communities via, the digital world. But I see Bitcoin as something that shifts consciousness over time because it becomes the internet. So the internet now is a cesspool. The internet is an echo of humanity. It doesn't lead, it follows. And so, of course, it's become a commercial cesspool. Of course, it's become a cesspool of exploitation. Of course, it's become a cesspool in which people manipulate each other. Of course, it's become a sex pool, sex pool, and a cesspool of pornography and exploitation there. And that's simply an echo of who we are and how we've evolved over the millennia. I believe that Bitcoin changes our consciousness because it becomes the digital space in which we all interact. And because it's inherently truthful, and because that will become more a part of that digital space, that truthfulness, we won't be able to exploit each other. We won't be able to lie to each other. We won't be able to manipulate each other. And we'll give up. We will surrender. And it's interesting that when I stopped drinking alcohol back in the 1980s and I put my foot into the world of recovery, the very first step in all recovery programs is admitted we were powerless over something, whether it's alcohol or drugs or sex or chocolate or whatever, and if it's something that one is struggling with. And I believe that humanity is struggling with itself and with this fiat world of exploitation and untruth. It's that surrender that I think will come slowly to the world. And the people who continue to try to manipulate and cheat and lie and steal will become further and further marginalized until the world leaves them behind. So the Donald Trumps of the world, who wield extraordinary power and influence in 2022, in 2032 won't be as relevant. And in 2042, I'm sorry, in 2132, and in 2222, 200 years from now, they will be this weird echo of a time in which we all were trying to get stuff and beat each other and win and accumulate. And we'll look back, or our ancestors and our progeny will look back and will be like, wow, that's weird. Because what will lead the way is a digital world in which truth is inviolable and untruth dies. And Bitcoin is the vehicle.
Okay. So how do you envision this reprogramming to happen? Because you're saying it's Bitcoin will be like an external force to humanity or to people. And the purity of that external force will sort of force people into more truth as time goes on. Because, my life passion have been our programming and how to change our programming. So how do you see that change happen in humans?
I believe that humans have the capacity for incredible beauty, and it's in every human being, even those with the most profound mental illness and narcissistic disorders, etc. But in the society in which we currently toil and live, that beauty is not rewarded, for lack of a better word. What's rewarded is something different. And we reward strength, and we reward power, and we reward aggression. And it's sort of natural. I work in schools, and the most powerful children in schools oftentimes are the most, physically able, the most athletic, the wealthiest. I mean, I could go on and on. So I don't see it as being that humans change because we come to some idea and then we enact that idea. I think when Satoshi created his white paper and when Bitcoin became this thing, and over the course of the last 13 years, as it's become an increasingly secure network, I don't think that he or whomever Satoshi is could even begin to fathom what was unleashed on the world. And for me, it's like the image of a bacterium eating a pollutant. So I know that in history, I don't remember, there were bacteria that were created that were going to eat oil spills. And so if there was an oil spill in the ocean that was a pollutant that was toxic, that was murderous to the animals of the ocean, you could add this bacterium, and the bacterium would consume the oil and transform it into algae. I may be making that up. That's sort of maybe science fiction. That's what I see Bitcoin as. The Bitcoin protocol will continue to grow, and the nodes will continue to expand. And not in the not too distant future, everybody will act as a validating node on their device, and there will be billions of validating nodes, and that will make the network completely inviolable, it's absolutely secure, and absolutely truthful. Over the course of time, when you live in a community in which a certain set of values predominate, you adopt those values. And you adopt them not consciously, you adopt them because it's just the natural, that's your community. If you live in a community, a family system in which the value, the most important value is truth and openness, well, that's part of your programming. I believe that over the course of generations, our programming will change to be utterly truthful and completely honest, and mental illness will become slip away, and our all of this explosion of neurological disorders and will slowly ebb away, because all of the catalysts that are creating this human disaster, this pollution that we have created for ourselves, will be eaten up by the virus or bacteria that we call Bitcoin. But I mean that with a positive connotation, not like virus in a negative sense. And we won't even know what's happening. It will be so subtle and it will take such a long period of time, we won't even be aware as a species that we are shifting. It will simply, over time, become anathema to our lives and the communities in which we live to be anything but what everybody seems to be. And that will be quiet, contemplative, loving, relational, truthful, communitarian. And it's fascinatingly to me, all because Satoshi wrote a white paper and something became, and now it is loosed on the world. And of course, it's going to go through its like phases of the Michael Saylors saying, here's a way to get rich, or the, it's going to go through all of these fiat-based iterations, but it's never going to go away. And it's going to become the base layer for all human existence. That's my uh, story. And I'm sticking with it.
So if we look at this through the lens of truth on the outside and truth on the inside, and if we look at it in terms of centralization and decentralization. So centralization tends to happen when people look for answers or truth outside of themselves, because then they're always looking for an authority to tell them the truth. So if they are outward looking, it goes towards centralization. And then if you go inside, you go towards your own truth. And then automatically decentralization happens because people are following their guidance from within, inner guidance or external guidance. And if we look at what's happening with the programming in these two different scenarios, is that when people are looking for truth outside of themselves, they adapt truths from this external authority. So they sort of take a truth and then they hold on to it. And then maybe they find another teacher and then they take that truth and they hold on to it. So then they act from this programming, right? Because it's how they see the world and they act according to this. And the decentralized version, when people go in, they don't want to hold on to these beliefs because that's just stopping them from finding their own source. So it's a matter of uncovering themselves. So people let go of beliefs and just sort of sink into the truth within themselves. So what I hear when you speak is you believe that people will still be more outward looking, but then it will just be Bitcoin there on the outside. So it will be sort of a decentralized reality on the outside. So then they will change their values and programming according to this external decentralized thing. While a faster method would be if people will be inspired by Bitcoin, like, oh, this is something true. And then somehow they also want to be true. And then they start the uncovering process. So rather than listening to, being shaped by the culture and that sort of external programs, it's not from their own soul. It's like external frequencies that they're keeping on. And they're just behaving like they're taught. But I'm talking about this revolution where they let go of all these external influences and they find their inner core. So they become their node on the network. And so then the programming doesn't even matter because built into this idea that I'm talking about is that the soul has this innate intelligence, like the intelligence that created this human body, that created the whole world. So it will not need programming. It will just flow because if you're connected to your node, you just flow. So that's sort of how I see it. That's a little bit of a difference between your visions and my visions. I think it will be more coming from inside rather than the culture shaping them.
Yeah, and so I think culture is an artifice. I think society is an artifice. I think government is an artifice. These are all things that we have created to make meaning out of our existence. I think religion is an artifice. These are all meaning-making vehicles because uh, we're always trying to make meaning out of things. And then, of course, those institutions, whether it's government or religion or industry, become more and more, they become bigger and bigger and more powerful because, again, it's the way people make meaning out of the world. However, and it's very difficult to break out of that meaning-making way of being because we live under that umbrella. That's the bubble in which we live. That's the meaning-making bubble in which we, as a species, exist. So to live outside of that is scary and it's hard. But in small communities, in small, intentional, relatively autonomous communities, bits and pieces of new culture can emerge. And it's not culture writ large, it's just community culture or family culture. Of course, it's profoundly influenced by the bigger culture at large. So a family might have the value system of liberal left ideology. Well, that's an artifice that has been created over the millennia based upon centralization and centralized institutions. I have a hard time envisioning people looking within and engaging in practices that essentially not only mitigate the power of centralized authority and centralized consciousness, but that eliminate it. I see humans as not being nearly that capable because I see most humans as existing in the first two levels of Maslow's pyramid of human needs. Most human beings, whether they are in desperate need of food and shelter and clothing, etc., or whether they are simply looking to amass more food and shelter and clothing, I see that those we live in this world of I'm just going to take care of what I need to take care of. I'm going to fulfill my needs. The way I see Bitcoin is not something that people will investigate and then adopt because it's a consciousness shifting paradigm, but they will investigate it and adopt it because they want to invest in it because they'll listen to Michael Saylor or Jack Mallers or whomever, and it won't matter. Like that doesn't matter because over the course of time, the Bitcoin network, which again will become this network in which lies go to die, will become so omnipresent, omniscient, omnipotent. It will pervade our lives, our existences so much that we will slowly shift into these different beings. And again, like that's why my take on time with Bitcoin is over centuries. And when people talk about, we need to get more people involved in Bitcoin and we need to orange pill people, etc., I don't see it that way. I used to because the network isn't going anywhere and it's only going to grow. And it's only going to grow because at the beginning, it's going to be part of the fiat world. But it's going to change the fiat world. And, your great, 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 great grandchildren and my great, 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 great grandchildren are going to live in a world that we wouldn't even come close to recognizing. And what's fascinating is I think it's going to be a much more analog world. We're going to be going back to a lot of how we lived in the 19th century. However, it won't be, it will be abundant. It will be small communities, and those communities will be based in this universality of truth, and we won't even notice it. The idea that, in 500 years, people look back and say, can you believe that our ancestors thought that it was really important to drive the fanciest cars? Like, what were they thinking? And so much of that will come because there'll be a slow shift in human collective consciousness. I'm not optimistic that there will be a revolution, a conscious revolution, that more and more people will embrace a Bitcoin standard and will come to see Bitcoin for what it is or how we see it. Because then that to me, like that feels to me like it becomes just another cultural icon or cultural experience informed by our current consciousness. Our current consciousness is a fiat current consciousness. And the most enlightened of us in the world are still are affected by that fiat consciousness. And so a Bitcoin revolution that's a conscious revolution is still informed by that fiat consciousness. It's hard to be patient, especially, from me being 60 years old. I'm kind of bummed out. I'll be around for a little bit longer, but I won't see nearly the impact that this extraordinary, I don't even want to call it a technology, but this life form, that this thing that was created that will permeate every nook and cranny of our existence, and all for the good. And I don't think we can see it. Certainly my friends simply see it as an investment vehicle. I think that human consciousness shifts slowly. And I think that human consciousness shifts when you live in communities over generations that embrace life a certain way. And I think that Bitcoin will make its way as the predominant digital network into every bit of our existence, and truth will become the norm. And when truth becomes the norm, human beings have reached the pinnacle of existence. There's no reason to lie. There's no reason to cheat. There's no reason to steal. There's no reason to accumulate. There's no homelessness, because everybody is seeking truth, and truth is compassionate, and truth is loving, and truth is communal, and truth is, this is why I find libertarianism so puzzling, and how this idea that because libertarians are informed, their consciousness is informed by a fiat world. They just don't want people messing with their shit. Well, think about a world in which nobody has shit to mess with. It feels pretty optimistic.
Yeah, I was just yesterday talking with my doctor friend, and so he's very, very nice, very kind. He's always following all the rules in society, but it's difficult for him to understand Bitcoin, and when we talk about how mass media is manipulated. And so we often go into arguments, friendly, but still arguments, because he sort of wants to understand, and he's sort of frustrated that he can't understand what I'm talking about. So he wants to understand, but it's always difficult for him. And I said maybe it's about the right side of the brain, right? Because he's a doctor, so he's been studying too much and just got completely stuck in the left brain. And so he can only think like one or two thoughts at the same time, while the right side is supposed to give like an overall picture and give more of a context. Can you relate that to, you talked about your friends?
Yeah, and I believe that because we're responding all the time to impulses, and impulses are caused by a surge of chemical and electrical processes in our bodies, and we become habituated to the way we respond to them, that, like, for instance, my friend group, they are deeply habituated to thinking about the world and understanding the world and grokking the world and experiencing the world that we live in, the world of money and finance and etc. And so when I talk about Bitcoin as being, the lichen and the moss that is on the forest floor that will eventually be the carpeting for the entire planet, and that carpeting will be the filter through which all information passes. And if that information is untruthful, it will just stay in the lichen. They look at me and go, "What?" Bitcoin is just like this thing that people invest in and that criminals in the dark web use when they hijack your computer for ransomware. I'm like, no, Bitcoin as an investment vehicle or whatever, that's sort of a very contemporary iteration of something that we can't understand. Like, think about how much we've come to understand about the human brain in the last 20 years and the different parts of the brain and how they interact with each other and how they operate. And it's so difficult to fathom who we will be as a species down the roads, big stretches of time, when you have a new digital paradigm emerging, Bitcoin, that will consume all other paradigms because it will reject those things that are exploitive and those things that are deceitful and those things that are untruthful, that don't reflect the truthfulness of our spirits and our existences. And people say, well, no, of course people will still lie, and of course people will still cheat, and of course people will still steal, because that's who we are. And my counter to that is, we have no idea who we're going to be. And when the medium of our existence demands truthfulness because lack of truthfulness has no utility and disappears, we will become different beings. Impossible to speculate what those beings will look like, or impossible to accurately do so, especially within this context of how our consciousnesses operate today. It's like that movie or the book by H.G. Wells, The Time Machine. He goes 500,000 years into the future and ends up in a community that is, to a great extent, completely unrecognizable. I think that in 3, 4, 500 years, our species will be unrecognizable to ourselves. I would love to have one glimpse a few hundred years into the future, and I think it's all because of Bitcoin, and that's why I'm disappointed in the name. I think that Bitcoin is a name now that's just laden with so much baggage, and the fact that it's called a coin. I mean, it's bit reality. It's digital truth.
And so we're talking about a lot of big time spans here. But what about if we zoom in a little bit to where we are now, and we are in a very strange position in the world. What do you think of the coming months?
I think that, I mean, I have no idea except
Mm.
based upon what I've seen for 60 years and how I extrapolate. I don't believe that the crises that we are experiencing now are any different from the crises we've experienced in the past in terms of their magnitude. I believe that those crises, the Ukraine Russia war, notwithstanding, because of the human suffering and other wars, human suffering, I believe that those crises are magnified and exploited for personal gain by people who inhabit the internet and the different, dark corners of the internet, which is what most of the internet is, like the YouTubers who claim that we're going to have a hyperinflationary global meltdown and that Bitcoin is going to be the only safe haven. I think that those narratives are always short-sighted, and we see the world in these like very finite swaths of time. So listening to people say, oh my gosh, in the next 6 months to a year, there's going to be a global financial meltdown. No, there's not. Oh, but the United States is $31 trillion in debt. So what? The United States, people have been freaking out about the United States and their level of debt for decades. Yeah, I get it. I mean, in 1971, Richard Nixon essentially abandoned our gold obligation, our obligations with regard to gold, and we went into this world of irredeemable currency. And I get that the central bank has printed trillions of dollars, and I get that there's a global currency system that's volatile, and I get that there have been situations in countries like Argentina and Zimbabwe and Weimar Germany where hyperinflation has occurred. I think that we greatly dramatize where we are, and we look at it and we say this is the crisis. This is the big one. And it won't be. You know, the big one will probably be something that we is not even on our radar. The big one will be some pathogen that is hyper contagious and airborne, and that has is extraordinarily lethal. The big one will be some kind of uh, geological moment in which some tectonic shift takes place that create. But like these are things that could happen tomorrow, or they could happen in 100 years. We don't know. We could be looking back in 20 years and say, wow, the United States is $570 trillion in debt. That's a half a quadrillion dollars. And people could say, yeah, everything's going to implode. But we've been saying everything's going to implode forever. Yeah, there are going to be bad moments. Is the next couple of years going to be tricky financially? Probably. Are risk on assets like Bitcoin going to, or, at least it's still a bit a risk on asset. Are they going to be? I'm not, but again, like I don't look at Bitcoin as monetarily. I don't hold a lot of
Mm.
Bitcoin. You
It's
know,
more a technology.
yeah, well, it's more like it's an intelligence. I think when the internet, the public internet became, proliferated and became, was invented in quotation marks, but the public internet, some 30 years ago, 40 years ago, it just got co-opted by the centralized paradigm, the fiat paradigm. I think that Bitcoin will be different and that the internet will go away and Bitcoin will become that thing we call the internet, and that all of the things that are built on that foundational layer will reflect the fact that everything is verified and is truthful. And that's going to, again, like those are really big, big chunks of time. But in the short term, I see all of the hype around. And let me qualify this by saying, look, if you're someone who lives paycheck to paycheck and you are struggling with inflation, that's real deal. If you're someone who lives in a war-torn country or a drought-stricken country, or if you, I mean, these are real-time crises for you. I do not think the global currency system is going to collapse. I do not think that the global business system is going to. We said it was going to collapse in 2008, 2009. Oh my gosh, the Baltic Dry Index is down at 20, and everybody's like, running to hoard their gold. It's like, no, we'll figure it out. I think we'll continue to figure it out for a very, very long time. But I do think that human suffering will continue. And I think that the fiat world and the fiat consciousness will continue to destroy lives. In the last 15 years, we have 3 times as many people with Parkinson's disease. In 20 years, we might have 10 times as many people with Parkinson's disease. I'm not saying it's going to be a rosy future in the short term, but I don't foresee collapse, because I think that that's the narrative. That's the disaster narrative. It's like terror porn.
Yeah, so it's a strong current in the Bitcoin community that you should stack as much sats as possible, as fast as possible. But from your experience with and thinking of neurological responses and how mental health and everything, what would be a wise approach for Bitcoiners who look forward to a Bitcoin standard coming in, and they think it's inevitable, so they want to stack all these sats, but the balance between their own health, and could you speak about that?
Yeah, I think it's fine to stack sats. And I do my little, I stack sats too, right? Like, again, it's not something that, I'm not trying to hold a lot of Bitcoin, but I believe that the way we live lives that are the healthiest are we live analog lives. I believe that the beauty of Bitcoin is it's going to be a digital foundation for a return to an analog existence. And when I say analog, I mean our hands in the dirt, our relationships with the people around us. And so, I mean, like me giving advice is hilarious, but if people are always checking their digital devices to see what's happening with their investments, if you're gnashing your teeth, if you're going through your days where a level of cortisol and adrenaline in your system is making you sick, you have to change that. If you we it's beneficial to consider changing that. Just from a neurophysiological standpoint, a little bit of cortisol is okay. A little bit of adrenaline is okay. Um, but you want a balance. You want to be able to access that serotonin enhanced, informed part of our consciousness. You want to be able to access that endorphin informed part of our consciousness. You want to be able to access that oxytocin informed part of our consciousness. Um, and so, my belief is you develop practices, and those practices that work best for you to feel at ease and quiet and content and fulfilled are the practices you pursue. Like for me, I walk 5 to 10 miles every day. I say hello to everybody and have conversations with people I don't know. I eat very healthily. I don't eat things like gluten and dairy, and I'm vegan, for no other reason that these are practices that work for me. I sit in meditation, not for very long, but I sit for maybe 20 minutes, 10, 20 minutes a day. I, um, I build relationships with those people around me that I'm with whom I'm interacting. I have a glass of wine on occasion, and I don't accumulate. I live a very minimalistic life. I can live out of my backpack if need be, and that works for me. It creates for me a sense of peace and quiet and contentment. Am I always peaceful and quiet and content? No. I get worked up, but I know what practices are best for me, and I know when I've fallen off the beam. And I think for some people for whom Bitcoin has become this crusade, if that works for you neurologically and you are healthy and it's not simply, an adrenaline rush, okay. But if you feel out of balance, if you just purchased a new car and the new car no longer makes you excited, well, maybe it's time to look at, what daily practices can I engage in that will bring me back into balance. I believe that Bitcoin will, in time, inform those daily practices.
Great. Thank you so much for coming on the show today.
I appreciate you having me.
Is it something else you've been thinking about that you would like to mention to this audience of consciousness people in the Bitcoin community?
Yeah, my views on Bitcoin, as I've stated in the interview, are that Bitcoin is going to impact humanity in ways that we can't fathom, and because it's going to become the digital foundation of how we interact, and it's going to be ultimate truth. The only thing I would like say to your audience or whatever is, as you become more aware of how your neurology works, your neurophysiology, and how you feel most connected to the world, pursue those practices. Meditation's a wonderful practice. There are so many practices that help us connect, and just find those for you that bring you that sense of like the world makes sense.
Good. Really nice to have you here. And we will see what the future brings. Both of us have optimistic. Maybe my timeline is a little bit faster. Maybe I'm just optimistic, hopeful. But you do the long game.
Yeah.
It's looking good for humanity either way.
Yeah, very optimistic.